Welcome to Altium Designer PCB Global Editing. In this module, we will learn about global editing of PCB objects using a combination of Find Similar Object, the PCB Panel, and the PCB Inspector Panels, as well as the PCB Filter. Global editing is a multi-step process starting with selection, followed by using various means for narrowing down the selection to the desired groups of selected objects. There are a few ways to begin the selection process. One you've already seen is the Find Similar Object method. Left-clicking on an object, we see it highlighted in the PCB and its properties in the Properties window. With it highlighted, we can also use the Find Similar Object from the pop-up panel and give us the option to fine-tune this selection. When we were looking at the PCB rule creation, we used a combination of Find Similar Object and PCB Filter panel to create the query expression for rules. We can follow a similar approach for global editing. With the reference designator selected, right-click to pull up the menu and click on Find Similar Objects. Here in the Find Similar Objects window, change the qualifier for the designator to Same, and make sure the Select Matching and Create Expression are checked before clicking OK. This will select all the designators on the PCB and populates the filter section of the PCB Filter panel. What if we want to narrow down our selection to only the designators of the components from the CAN schematics that are on top of the PC board? Note, for the purpose of example, there are a couple of components R1 and R2 from the CAN schematics that we have temporarily moved to the bottom of the PC board. They would still be in the CAN component class. Looking at the PCB Filter panel for further refinement, we see the query generated from the Find Similar Objects action. Let's click on the Helper button so we can further refine our selection. Use the Membership Checks option to populate the right side window. Here we can scroll down to find In Component class. Double-clicking on it adds it to the query we're building. Inside the parentheses for the In Component class, add a single quote. This prompts Altium Designer to open up a selection window containing valid component classes. We will, of course, pick the CAN interface to narrow down our selection to only those components from the CAN interface schematics. Now, to complete the query, click on the AND operator. Click OK. Now we have selected all of the CAN interface schematic component designators on the top and the bottom. We could also have clicked on the Check Syntax button to ensure that we had a valid query before we hit OK. Back in the PCB Filter panel, click on Apply to All, and we see the effect of the selection. Let's further refine this selection, clicking on the helper again. Now we click on the Layer Checks function and scroll down to On Top Silkscreen selection. You might be tempted to pick Top Layer or On Silkscreen, but those would not work for our purpose. Top Layer is the metal layer and does not have any silkscreen on it, while On Silkscreen does not narrow our selection to the components on the top of the PCB. Their reference designators use the Top Silkscreen layer. Don't forget to add the AND operator before clicking OK. Now we see the updated expression in the PCB Filter panel. To verify what this selects, click on Apply to All and note that we have selected all of the CAN bus reference designators on the top. With them selected, we could do a number of operations here, from hiding the reference designators to changing the text height and width. Going to the Properties panel, we can directly edit the selected group of designators. Let's change their size. Click on the text height and enter 40. Now click on the text width 10 mil entry. We will make it 8 mil. Notice the instant change. This is an important concept and one that bears some discussion, so before we continue, the actions performed in the PCB Inspector panel work directly on the design database and bypass rule checking. Be aware that some edits performed on the PCB can in fact violate PCB rules, as we are working on the database and not through the PCB GUI. Always run DRC checks afterwards. We will be looking at DRC checking in a future module. As always, we can clear the selection and return to the normal unmasked or dimmed view by holding the Shift button and clicking the C key. Notice the two components on the bottom layer. They are part of the CAN interface, but were not affected by the global edit due to their placement on the bottom of the PC board. Again, this was reflected in their reference designators having the on-bottom silkscreen property instead of on-top silkscreen. This example of globally editing a group of objects, in this case all of the top CAN interface reference designators, illustrates the process of selection, refining of selection, and editing of multiple objects. Using the PCB panel is another way to start the selection process. Opening up the PCB panel, we select components from the pull-down menu. Make sure the Select checkbox is checked. Likewise, zoom and clear existing as well. Let's look at locking the Digital I/O's PWM connectors. Start by clicking on the Digital I/O component class in the upper panel selection. The components in the Digital I/O are listed below. Let's click on all the I/O headers. Either click on the top and then hold down the Shift key and click on the bottom, or click each one while holding down the Control key. Using the Control key would allow you to select non-sequential entries if you desire. Now looking at the Properties panel, we can lock the selected components by simply checking the lockbox in the Location section. As before, clicking anywhere on the PCB unselects the components, but to clear the masking, use Shift and C key. Now if you try to just single click on one of those locked components on the PCB to select it, it does not highlight it as it is locked. To unlock them, either double quick click on it or use the rectangle sweep to select it using left or right. As you can see, that connectors and tracks in this instance were selected. To reduce the scope, we could have changed the selection filter to enable only components to be selected before we had done the selection. But after we've selected components and tracks, we can still tune the selection using the PCB filter window. Clear the filter pane and select the component checkbox. Now click on the Apply to Selected to use the Is Component filter to select only components. At this point, we could unset the lock in the Properties panel. This is just one of the many ways to locate, select, and then refine the selection using a combination of PCB, PCB filter, and property panels. In the PCB panel's component view, the locked components are indicated by a locked icon. These can be cleared or set directly from here as well by clicking on the lock to toggle it. Likewise, in the PCB list, with the component selected, we could also uncheck the locked box. As you can see, there are a number of ways to unlock or lock components, as well as multiple means for narrowing your selection of objects in the PCB using a number of options. The PCB list panel is useful for seeing all the objects associated with the PCB. The panel shows all the PCB objects in the list. This list, in fact, can be sorted. There are a number of settings at the top of the panel. The View Edit button is a simple pop-up menu for switching between just viewing and to allow for editing. The next two options allow for setting the scope of the list, starting with the state of the objects. All of them, non-masked, or just selected. We have already seen the selected objects, allowing us to see only those in the list. To see all the objects in the PCB, click on the drop-down menu at the top panel and pick All Objects. This list includes non-obvious things like PCB rules and the nets in the design, as well as what you would expect, components and tracks, etc. Clicking on a column heading will sort the displayed list in alphabetical order. A further refinement of displayed objects is under the Include menu. This allows you to narrow the scope of the listed objects, selecting only certain objects to display. We will pick Include Only Components to narrow down the selection. Now we see all the components listed. If the panel is in edit mode, the various entries can be modified. One example is the rotation of a component. Selecting a component and scrolling over to locate the rotation column, click on the entry and now you can enter the new rotation and have it see the effect immediately. Having one list with all objects is useful when trying to find a stray item, for example. The typical situation is with an errant text box containing a space placed somewhere off the PCB causing errors. Sorting the location columns by clicking on the head sorts the entries and can point out stray objects based on their reported locations. In addition, if a DRC error points to a location but it's not clear what is there, using the PCB list panel can provide information about an object located at a particular location. For example, it may have been hidden using the View Configuration menu. The PCB list panel provides for identifying the errant object by selecting the object in the PCB list, highlighting it, to allow us to select and delete if needed. This concludes Module 23, PCB Global Editing, where we looked at the various selection methods, then ways to narrow the selection before editing a group of objects using the Properties panel. Please do exercise 23. Please do the exercise Global Editing.